Inside your bulletin today is a little auto. It's not an auto. It's a biography of C.S. Lewis. And Mr. Lewis is a prolific writer, he was, and one of the popular stories that you might be familiar with would be his Chronicles of Narnia. And they made several films based on that. The most popular was Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a story which a lot of young people really, really enjoy. Mr. Lewis, in the 40s, was on the radio, and he did a series of radio presentations in apologetics. In other words, teaching why we would believe in Jesus Christ. And later they gathered those radio speeches, they gathered them up and they formed them into a book entitled Mere Christianity. And I want to read for you this morning a quotation from Mere Christianity. He writes as follows: I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. And he's talking about Christ. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing you must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Amen. Our passage this morning is again found in John chapter 8. It also is located on the back of your bulletin. Verses 12 through 20. Really verses 12 through 19. Again, therefore, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. Verse 13. The Pharisees therefore said to him, You are bearing witness of yourself. Your witness is not true. Jesus answered and said to them, Even if I bear witness of myself, my witness is true. For I know where I come from and where I am going. But you do not know where I came from or where I'm going. You people judge according to the flesh. I'm not judging anyone. But even if I do judge, my judgment is true. For I am not alone in it, but I and he who sent me. Even in your law it has been written that the testimony of two men is true. I am he who bears witness of myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness of me. And so they were saying to him, Where is your Father? Jesus answered, You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. We spoke briefly last week regarding verse 12. I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but he shall have the light of life. And the Pharisees, in verse 13 then, they do not attack what he says. They don't say, well, you can't be the light of the world. They don't say, who do you think you are saying you're the light of the world? They don't attack that part. What they do is they play the current political game of gotcha. Okay? That's what happens in our politics all the time.
Amen.
The politician gets up and says something, and we don't know if it's true or not. But then we veer off on some technicality or a rabbit trail somewhere. That's what they do here. The Pharisees say, aha, now we've got you. And the technicality is that you are trying to bear witness to yourself. And therefore, your witness is not true. Another translation of that might be valid, or it's not solid enough to stand up in court as evidence because it's not corroborated. This is the game that they have chosen to play. And so in verse 14, Jesus responds and he says to them, well, even if I bear witness to myself, my witness is true. Let's stop there for a second and look at that. The fact of the matter is that there are some things that are self-evident. They're true. We read in the Constitution of the United States, for example, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These truths are self-evident. You don't have to prove them, they prove themselves. And that's the kind of thing Jesus is talking about here. He says, my witness is true because it is true. And, if you think of another example, for example, maybe like gravity. Gravity is self-evident. It is true whether you believe in it or not.
Amen.
And those who have chosen not to believe in it often find themselves in a bit of a pickle. We've all heard the story about the young man, maybe when we were kids. Superman was a popular hero back in those days. And how many of us didn't put a towel around our neck and try to fly like Superman? And some, the really bold ones, would go find a high spot to jump off of and fly. I only went high enough to make the cape fly out away from my body a little bit, so I could get the feel of it. I am aware of some who went clear up on top of the garage and dove off. And their experience was not as joyful as mine. Because gravity is self-evident. It's true whether you believe in it or not. And, Jesus is saying the same thing here. He's saying, for you to contradict me, that would be like going up to the sun itself and saying, you're not hot and you're not light, you're dark. And how foolish would that be? Because the sun is self-evident. its content, its values, its everything that it produces, it's all self-evident. And so Jesus makes that statement. He says, even if I bear witness of myself, my witness is true. But he goes on and he says more. He says in verse 14, second half, for I know where I came from, and I know where I'm going. But you do not know where I came from, or where I'm going. So he goes on beyond the self-evident truth, the self-evidence of his truth. And he says, it's also true because I have self-knowledge, full, complete self-knowledge. We, in our oath that we state when we go to be a witness in a trial, they typically will ask us, do you promise to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth? The whole truth is what we're talking about. And Jesus knows the whole truth. He knows where he came from, and he knows where he's going. And it's really kind of a cool, I think, a great statement. In one sentence, he mentions his pre-existence with the Father and his predicted glorification with the Father. That's just a cool idea and a cool thought. Over in John chapter 16, he says a similar thing with the same idea. He says, I came from the Father and have come into the world. I'm leaving the world again and going back to the Father. John 16:28. And so here we have a man who really, really knows the whole truth. And that's the basis of why the Pharisees should accept his statement that he did. So, verse 14, Jesus answered and said therefore to them, even if I bear witness of myself, my witness is true, for I know where I came from and I know where I'm going. But you do not know where I came from or where I'm going. So he gets a little judgmental here about the Pharisees. He says, you, on the other hand, have a flawed knowledge, a partial knowledge. Your knowledge is not complete. And therefore, your judgment is imperfect. He says in verse 15, you people judge according to the flesh. This is a difficult concept to translate. And you can kind of get an idea of how difficult it is to translate when you look at some of the many different efforts, attempts to translate it. This is translated in the King James Bible, ye judge after the flesh. That's a very literal translation. Ye judge after the flesh. Let's see some of the different ways that people have tried to make the sense of this. In the New American Standard, we read, you people judge according to the flesh. And if you look over in the margin, on mine anyway, it says, according to a carnal standard, is another way to say that. The New English Bible says, you judge by worldly standards. William Beck has a translation out. He says, he translates it, you judge in a human way. And R.A. Torrey, who was a great Bible teacher, you judge from outward appearance. Another commentator says, you judge superficially. And the Phillips translation says, you judge by human standards, which is also pretty much what you have in the New International Version. You judge by human standards. All of these are an attempt to translate these words of Jesus, where he's saying, your judgment is imperfect because you can't judge by the same standard that I can. You have a limited judgment. Leon Morris is a Bible commentator, and he says this about that. He says the Pharisees, they are not in a position to comment on his witness. They are totally unaware of the great heavenly verities. Isn't that beautiful? The great heavenly verities. Those great verities are truths. And the great heavenly verities, these are the teachers of the day in Jesus' time. And as this man points out, they're clueless. That's how we would say it today. They're clueless. They are totally unaware of the great heavenly verities. I just love that. Swiss philosopher Rousseau, he said probably the best thing here. He says this. He gives this advice. He says, "Do not judge, and you will never be mistaken." So that's the wise way to avoid the whole issue. Really good advice for all of us. Because actually Jesus doesn't want us judging. And his point was he didn't come to judge at that time either. He says, I didn't come to condemn the world. I came to save those who are lost. So let's move to verses 16 and following. He says, "But even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for I am not alone in it. But I and he who sent me." And some versions have I and the Father who sent me. Verse 17. "Even in your law it has been written that the testimony of two men is true," or valid in a court of law. Verse 18. "I am he who bears witness of myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness of me." And so Jesus concedes, okay, if you want two witnesses, I can provide that. I and God the Father. And he quotes from the Old Testament. He says, even in your law, it says, if you have the testimony of two, then you can, that confirms it as true. And so he says, it's I and the Father who sent me. So when I speak, he's saying, when I speak, Jesus, there are two of us saying this. Well, they recognize that right away. So now they've tried to catch him on this technicality. That's not working out for him. Jesus is defending that quite nicely. And so what happens next is what is called argumentum ad hominem. That's a Latin phrase that means against an argument against the man. The personal attack. If you can't get him on the content and you can't catch him on the technicality, then you're going to move to a personal attack. And Jesus mentions the Father. And so they, being worldly wise and knowing about Jesus' shady background, say to him in verse 19, "Where is your Father?" Salam. So they bring up the old rumors about how Jesus was illegitimate. Okay. And so they're trying to discredit him in front of his many disciples. They couldn't get him on the technicality, and now they attack him personally. Jesus does not really rise to the bait. He just continues on. He says, "You know neither me nor my Father." if you knew me, you would know my Father. And so with that statement, Jesus tells us that personal knowledge of Him is required. This is not the only time He says this. Over in John chapter 14, you might remember where He's talking about being the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. Verse 7, if you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you know Him and have seen Him. Philip said to Him, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough. See, Philip's still not getting it. And Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and yet you have not come to know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? And he's distressed at Philip's lack of understanding. I suspect that today he would be distressed at the lack of understanding of so many of us. Ken Boa, pastor, says this. It's kind of cool. No one can know the Word of God without knowing the God of the Word. Okay? The natural man does not receive spiritual truths. And so it is when you don't know Jesus, you won't know the Father. And that's the truth that he's pointing out here. These Pharisees, they're blinded. They're blinded and they don't like what he's saying. How did he start this off? I am the light of the world. And they don't like that. Because the light exposes their blindness. It exposes their sin. That's why they've determined to kill him. But they can't legally and in front of all these people who like Jesus. They can't just up and kill him the way they'd like to. Jesus tells us why they hate the light so much. Back in chapter 3, he was talking about men loving darkness rather than light. In chapter 3, verse 19, he says this, this is the judgment, that the light is come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than the light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light. Why did they hate Jesus? Because he's a blinding light. And he's proclaiming himself as the light of the world. Everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest their deeds should be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be manifest as having been wrought in God. So we kind of come full circle here. We have to ask ourselves, do we know Jesus? In Jesus' words, if we want to know God, we need to know Jesus. If we had known Jesus, we would have known God. And he says to these fellows here, you don't know me, and if you had known me, then you would know God. We go back to what C.S. Lewis said. Could Jesus just be a great teacher? A moral teacher? Not if he's telling lies, like proclaiming himself the light of the world. A great moral teacher couldn't do that unless he was actually who he said he was. And that's Lewis's point. Either Jesus was one of the greatest liars of all time, or what else would you think of a man who says, I'm the light of the world, and God is my Father? You would think he's a nut. Either he's a liar or he's a nut. he's a lunatic. Or you have to fall down at his feet and to accept his proclamation and proclaim him Lord of the universe and the Messiah of God, the Son of God. That's our question that we each have to answer today. Which one? Let's close this morning by singing hymn number 424. We'll sing just a single stanza of Heavenly Sunlight. And I'll ask you to stand.